The hearing lasted 4 minutes. Evan Miller knew this because the digital clock on the courtroom wall flicked from 9:11 to 9:15 while his life was being reclassified. No witnesses. No testimony. No discussion of facts. The judge didn't look at him once. Probation violation confirmed, the judge said, already reaching for the next file. Administrative remand approved. Evan opened his mouth to speak. His public defender touched his arm, not firmly, not urgently. Just enough to signal that speaking now would not improve the outcome. I didn't violate anything, Evan said anyway. His voice sounded wrong in the room, like it didn't belong to the acoustics. The judge finally glanced up, eyes flat. The system disagrees. That was it. The bailiff was already moving. Evan had been on probation for 11 months following a nonviolent offense, a plea deal that existed mostly to keep the docket moving. He'd complied with everything: weekly check-ins, drug screenings, mandatory employment logs, counseling sessions that felt more like attendance drills than therapy. No failed tests, no missed appointments, no warnings. Yet here he was, being escorted out of a courtroom as if the decision had been inevitable. In the hallway, Evan turned to his attorney. "What violation?" he asked. The attorney didn't answer immediately. He adjusted his tie, glanced down the corridor, then leaned closer. "It's marked procedural noncompliance," he said quietly. "That doesn't mean anything." The attorney gave a thin smile. "It means it doesn't need to." 2 deputies transported Evan not to county jail, but to a facility outside the city. No Sainig. No Intak Sainig. No name that appeared on the paperwork beyond a line item code. The building looked administrative rather than punitive. Clean. Neutral. No bars on the windows. Inside, everything smelled faintly of disinfectant and printer toner. Processing was silent. No fingerprinting. No muksot. No property inventory. Instead, Evan was seated at a desk across from a woman in a gray blazer who introduced herself as a case alignment officer. "You're not being incarcerated," she said calmly. "You're being stabilized." Evan blinked. "I was sentenced to probation." "Yes," she replied, "and probation identified a deviation." "What deviation?" She turned a monitor slightly toward him. On the screen was a chart. Not behavior, not infractions. Trajectory, employment instability curve, residential volatility index, compliance fatigue probability. Evan stared. "That's not a violation. It's a projection," she said. "The system flagged a future outcome risk. You can't punish someone for something they haven't done." The woman's expression didn't change. "We don't classify this as punishment." Evan laughed once, sharply. "Then what do you call it?" "Prevention," she said. He was assigned a new designation: administrative custody, level gray. No sentence length. No release date. That night, Evan was placed in a dormitory with 40 other men. They weren't violent. They weren't aggressive. They were muted. Most wore county-issued clothing without insignia. Some stared at walls. Some read the same pamphlets repeatedly. No televisions. No clocks. Evan tried talking to the man on the bunk beside him. "What are you in for?" The man hesitated, as if searching for the correct script. "I exceeded my risk profile," he said finally. Another man overheard and added, "I optimized wrong." Evan's stomach tightened. Over the next few days, Evan learned the rules. There were no disciplinary write-ups, only adjustments. No guards, only monitors. No appeals, only reviews, which always concluded with the same phrase: "Current status remains appropriate." People disappeared quietly, not dragged away, not restrained. Their bunks were reassigned by morning. One man named Curtis whispered to Evan during lights down. "This place isn't jail," Curtis said. "It's where probation sends you when they don't know what else to do with you." Evan asked, "What happens if you finish probation?" Curtis smiled faintly. Nobody finishes here. Evan requested a formal hearing. The request was acknowledged, then reclassified. Instead of a hearing, he was assigned a behavioral alignment session. The session wasn't therapy. It wasn't interrogation. It was calibration. Screens displayed scenarios, choices, consequences. Evan's responses were tracked not for morality, but for predictability. When his answers deviated, the facilitator noted them without comment. At the end, she said, "Your independence metrics remain elevated." "That's not illegal," Evan said. She nodded. "But it is inefficient." On day 17, Evan saw something that finally broke the illusion. A new intake arrived, a teenager. No record. No anche el monitor. Just a juvenile transfer marked administrative overflow. The kid looked terrified. Evan stepped forward instinctively. A monitor intervened gently. "Please return to your assigned zone," she said. "What happens to him?" Evan asked. She paused. "He will be normalized," she said. That night, Evan made a decision. If the system didn't operate on guilt or innocence, if it only responded to friction, then the only way out wasn't compliance. It was disruption. And Evan realized, too late, that the system had already anticipated that thought. Because the next morning, his status changed again. Administrative custody, level black. And beside it, a note. Subject demonstrates escalating resistance. Long-term resolution recommended. Level black didn't look different. That was the most unsettling part. No new cell. No restrants. No dramatic escalation. Evan woke up in the same dormitory, on the same bunk, under the same fluorescent lights that never fully turned off. The men around him breathed, shifted, stared at nothing. Only the air felt tighter, as if something had been sealed. At morning count, Evan's name wasn't called, not skipped, omitted. The monitor paused at his bunk, glanced at her tablet, then moved on. Evan raised his hand. "You missed me." She looked directly at him for the first time since his arrival. "You are no longer part of this count," she said. "What does that mean?" "It means you've moved into a different category," she replied calmly. "Which category?" She hesitated, not because she didn't know, but because the wording mattered. "Non-integrative probationary subject," she said. "You're still here. You're just not the point of reference anymore." Evan felt cold. He noticed the changes slowly after that. The doors still opened for him, but a half-second later than before. His meal tray arrived without eye contact. His name disappeared from the dorm's assignment board, replaced by a numeric placeholder. Men stopped asking him questions. Not because they were afraid, because the system subtly discouraged interaction. Noise suppression. Isolation without walls. Evan tried to speak to Curtis. Curtis blinked at him like he was trying to remember something he'd once known. "Sorry," Curtis said after a moment. "I think we're not supposed to talk now." "Who told you that?" Evan asked. Curtis frowned. "I don't know. It just feels inefficient." That word again. Evan requested legal counsel. The request was processed. Status returned. Resolved, counsel not applicable. He asked why. The response came later that day, delivered by a man Evan hadn't seen before. "No uniform. No badge. Just a clean button-down shirt and a folder tucked under his arm." "My name is Daniel Horowitz," the man said. "I oversee adjudication continuity." Evan sat across from him in a windowless room that looked more like a conference space than an interrogation chamber. "You don't have the right to hold me here indefinitely," Evan said. Horowitz nodded. "You're correct. Indefinite detention would be unlawful. So release me." Horowitz smiled faintly. "You're not detained." Evan stared. "Then what am I?" Horowitz opened the folder. "Probation is a legal fiction," he said. "A bridge between incarceration and autonomy. Most people cross it successfully. Some destabilize it. I didn't." You did, Horowitz said gently. Just not behaviorally. He slid a document across the table. It wasn't a charge sheet. It was a risk synthesis. Evan's life reduced to vectors: education gaps, employment volatility, social network density. Nothing illegal. Nothing dramatic. Just inconvenient. The justice system isn't designed to resolve every outcome, Horowitz continued. So auxiliary frameworks exist. Yours flagged early. You're incarcerating people because they might become problems, Evan said. Horowitz shook his head. We're reallocating resources before they do. Evan leaned forward. What happens to the people who never leave? Horowitz met his eyes. They stop generating strain. That night, Evan witnessed his first transition. A man named Robert, quiet, middle-aged, compliant to the point of invisibility, was escorted out of the dorm. Not restrained, not frightened. I finished my review, Robert whispered to Evan as he passed. They said I'm stable now. Evan never saw him again. But the next day, Evan noticed something disturbing. Robert's name appeared on a digital display near intake. Not under custody, under external placement, with a location code Evan didn't recognize. He asked a monitor about it. She responded automatically. Mr. Harris has been successfully integrated. Integrated where? She paused, then corrected herself. Integration is not geographically defined. That was when Evan realized the scope. This wasn't a facility. It was a sorting mechanism. Probation didn't end here. Transformed. Evan started observing patterns. Men who complied completely disappeared quickly. Men who resisted aggressively escalated into isolation and eventually resolution. But men who asked questions, they lingered, kept alive, studied. Evan understood why. Resistance was predictable. Compliance was predictable. Curiosity wasn't. During a behavioral alignment session, Evan deliberately altered his responses. Not to comply, to confuse. He answered some questions with statistical logic, others with emotional contradiction. He disrupted their predictive models. The facilitator frowned. You're increasing variance, she said. That's the point, Evan replied. She ended the session early. That night, a man approached Evan's bunk. Older. Gaunt. Eyes sharp. You're doing it wrong, the man whispered. Evan looked at him. Doing what wrong? Fighting them, the man said. They don't mind resistance. They track it. Then what do they mind? The man leaned closer. Unclassifiable behavior. The man's name was Thomas. He'd been there 5 years. Not sentenced. Not released. Probation overflow, Thomas said. Back when they still called it that. Thomas explained the truth Evan hadn't fully grasped yet. This system didn't exist to punish crime. It existed to preempt disorder. People like Evan weren't mistakes. They were test cases. Why keep us alive? Evan asked. Thomas smiled thinly. Because killing people creates records, and releasing us creates uncertainty. Evan felt a knot tighten in his chest. They're not afraid of violence, Thomas continued. They're afraid of narratives they can't close. Evan realized then what level black truly meant. It wasn't harsher confinement. It was long-term observation. That night, Evan wrote something on the back of a pamphlet using a borrowed pen. Not a confession, not a plan, pattern, a way to behave that produced contradictory data. He passed it to Thomas. Thomas nodded once. By morning, 5 men were acting differently, subtly, enough to create noise. And somewhere above them, in systems Evan couldn't see, alarms began to register not threat, but confusion, which was far more dangerous, because the system could tolerate defiance, but it could not tolerate ambiguity. The first sign that the system was slipping wasn't alarms or lockdowns. It was scheduling errors. Meal distribution arrived 12 minutes late. 2 behavioral alignment sessions overlapped for the same individual. A monitor addressed Evan by name, then corrected herself mid-sentence and avoided him for the rest of the day. Small things. But systems like this were built on precision. Small things didn't drift. They were corrected, unless correction itself had become computationally expensive. Within 48 hours of Evan and the others introducing noise, the dormitory felt different. Not louder, not chaotic, just uncertain. Men hesitated before following instructions. Some forgot the exact phrasing they'd been trained to use. Others responded too quickly, as if overcompensating. Evan noticed monitors consulting their tablets more frequently, brows furrowed, fingers tapping screens that didn't immediately respond. Thomas watched all of this with quiet satisfaction. "They don't know which version of us to expect anymore," he whispered. "That's dangerous for them." "What happens now?" Evan asked. Thomas shrugged. "Now they decide whether to isolate the variable or rewrite the model." That decision came sooner than Evan expected. One evening, the dorm was ordered to remain seated. No explanation. No time frame, just a calm announcement that echoed slightly too evenly through the speakers. After an hour, a group of men were escorted out. Not the loud ones, not the compliant ones, the ambiguous ones. Thomas was among them. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. As he passed Evan, he met his eyes and shook his head once. A warning, not a farewell. Evan never saw him again. The next morning, Thomas's bunk was gone. Not reassigned. Removed. The space where it had been was marked with tape on the floor, like a temporary boundary waiting for redefinition. Evan's status updated. Administrative custody, level /conditional observation. The added phrase mattered. Conditional meant there were still options. But not for long. Evan was summoned to a review. Not a room this time. A transport. He was escorted into a vehicle with tinted windows and no visible restraints. The ride lasted 40 minutes. No sirens. No abrupt turns. The kind of drive designed to feel normal. The building they arrived at looked like a corporate campus. Glass. Landscaping. Neutral signage that said nothing and meant everything. Inside, Evan was brought into a conference room with a long table and 6 empty chairs. One by one, people entered. A woman from continuity operations. A man from risk forecasting. Another from judicial optimization. None introduced themselves by name. Evan realized why. Names implied accountability. They spoke in sequence like a relay. "You are creating cascading anomalies," one said. "Your behavior is propagating across cohorts," said another. "We need to determine whether this is correctable," said a third. Evan leaned back. "You could let me go." The woman smiled politely. "Release increases variance. So does detaining me." "Yes," she agreed, "but only temporarily." Evan felt the trap closing. They explained it then, not fully but enough. This wasn't a prison system failure. It was a probation overflow mechanism designed to prevent future strain on courts, jails, welfare systems, and public trust. People weren't removed because they committed crimes. They were removed because they complicated projections. "Most individuals stabilize once reassigned," one official said. "Some resist. Fewer adapt creatively." "And those?" Evan asked. The man hesitated. "Those are reassessed." Evan understood what had happened to Thomas. Reassessment wasn't relocation. It was decomposition, breaking a person's data footprint into smaller, harmless components. Employment fragments, address fragments, identity fragments. Alive, but nowhere complete enough to matter. Evan stood. "You're dismantling people." The woman tilted her head. "We're preventing collapse." "What if I told you people would accept collapse more readily than this?" Evan said. Silence. That wasn't in their models. The meeting ended without resolution. Evan was returned to the facility. But it wasn't the same. By morning, the dorm was half empty. The remaining men were quieter, more compliant. The ambiguous ones were gone. Evan was isolated, not in a cell in relevance. He stopped appearing on internal displays. Monitors no longer checked on him. His meals arrived inconsistently. He realized the truth with a jolt of fear. They weren't watching him anymore. They were letting him fade. One night, Evan woke to find a man sitting on the edge of his bunk. A new face, young, nervous. "They told me you'd help," the man whispered. "Who told you that?" Evan asked. The man swallowed. "A probation officer. Off record." Evan sat up slowly. This wasn't random. This was leakage. The system had developed cracks. Not failures, dissent. People inside the institution had started questioning outcomes they couldn't justify. Quietly redirecting cases. Whispering names. Evan wasn't just an anomaly anymore. He was a reference. The next day, Evan's name appeared on a public docket. Not released. Not detained. Status. Pending clarification. That phrase spread. Advocacy groups noticed. A legal blog mentioned it in passing. A law professor asked a question during a panel. The system responded aggressively. Transfers resumed. Files locked. Interfaces hardened. But it was too late. Evan had learned the final truth. This system couldn't be exposed directly. It could only be overloaded with humanity. Every time someone hesitated, every time a clerk asked why, every time a probation officer delayed a referral, noise accumulated. The machine slowed. Evan was taken again, this time without explanation. No transport, no meeting, just a door that closed behind him. He was placed in a room with no screens, no assessments, no future. A final status appeared briefly on a tablet outside the door. Resolution path. Internal. Evan understood what that meant. But he also understood something else. Resolution was no longer quiet, and silence was no longer guaranteed. The room was smaller than Evan expected. No distrants. No camera in plain sight. No bricht interrogation lights. Just a chair, a table bolted to the floor, and walls painted a color so neutral it felt deliberate. The kind of space designed to leave no impression, no memory worth holding on to. This was internal resolution. Evan waited. Time stopped behaving normally. There was no clock, no sound from outside. He couldn't tell if minutes or hours passed. The system had removed the one metric humans rely on most. Eventually, a door opened. Not guards. 3 people entered, each carrying a tablet. They sat across from him, evenly spaced, like a panel that didn't want to look like one. No introductions. The woman in the center spoke first. "Your case has exceeded acceptable processing cost," she said. "You've destabilized multiple downstream workflows." Evan nodded. "That was the point." "Yes," she said. "Which is why you're here." A screen embedded in the table activated. It displayed Evan's life, not as memories, but as interfaces. Employment records, probation reports, credit history, social connections, all slowly dimming. "You've reached a threshold," the man on the left said. "Not of guilt, of utility." "What does internal resolution actually mean?" Evan asked. The man on the right answered. "It means you no longer move through public systems." Evan felt a chill. "You're erasing me." "No," the woman corrected. "Erasure leaves gaps. Gaps attract attention." She tapped her tablet. "We fragment." They explained it clinically. Evan wouldn't be killed. He wouldn't disappear overnight. His identity would be deconstructed and redistributed across low-impact environments. A job with no advancement, housing without permanence, medical care without continuity, social presence without influence. He would exist everywhere just enough not to be noticed. Alive, free, harmless. "This is mercy," the woman said. Evan leaned forward. "You're afraid of me." The man on the left shook his head. "We're afraid of replication." They showed him projections. What happened when people like Evan weren't resolved quickly? Questions spread. Probation officers hesitated. Judges asked for clarification. Journalists noticed anomalies. Trust eroded. Order doesn't collapse dramatically, the woman said. It erodes quietly, and then it doesn't recover. Evan laughed softly. So you sacrifice people to protect belief. We optimize outcomes, she replied. Evan looked at the screen. Among the fading data points, he saw something new. A line item labeled residual influence. It wasn't zero. He pointed at it. What's that? The woman hesitated just for a moment. Legacy effect, she said. Unavoidable. Evan smiled for the first time in weeks. You can't fully remove me, he said, because people noticed. Silence. That silence told him everything. The system could erase individuals, but it struggled with ideas that had already entered other systems. The meeting ended without ceremony. Evan signed nothing. He was released 2 days later. Not freed. Reallocated. He woke up in a different state with a different ID and a job he didn't remember applying for. The apartment was small. Functional.
Grazie. No anche il monitor.
No probation officer. No court dates. But also no future. Promotions never came. Addresses changed every year. Doctors never kept records long enough to notice patterns. People forgot him easily. Friends drifted without conflict. This was the system's final solution, and it almost worked, except for the cracks. Evan began to notice small disturbances. A clerk who double-checked a form. A probation officer who delayed a referral just in case. A judge who asked why an administrative violation lacked evidence. The system corrected most of it, but not all. Years later, a Lowell Review article cited a cluster of unexplained probation remands. A podcast mentioned gray custody. A civil liberties group filed a narrowly scoped FOIA request that wasn't denied immediately. The system adapted, but it moved slower now. Somewhere inside a courthouse, a new trainee asked an old question. Where do these people go? And someone hesitated before answering. Evan never became important again. That was intentional. But importance wasn't the only measure. Because the system had learned something it couldn't unlearn. There were humans who didn't break rules, didn't resist violently, didn't comply quietly. They disrupted by existing incorrectly. And once that pattern existed, couldn't be unseen. If you believe justice systems only punish crimes, you're wrong. They also manage futures. And sometimes, when the system decides your future is too expensive, it won't lock you up. It will let you live, just quietly,